Thank you, Helen, and thank you to Caroline and Pat for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. The topic, as you can see, is one that deals with children who are adversely affected by their parents drinking. And I have cunningly used, children of problem drinkers, because as I get into this, you'll see that some of the conceptual stuff and some of the linguistic stuff is complicated. I'm going to begin with a personal anecdote. This is the risk of having people who are called emeritus address you, that I slip back into my anecdotage. I'll try to resist that. In 1977, I started working in an alcohol unit in the old St. Brendan's Hospital in Dublin. This was called the Grange Gorman. They talk a lot about what they used to refer to disparagingly as Victorian lunatic asylums. Grange Gorman was pre-Victorian. It was very old and huge, the biggest psychiatric hospital in the country. And in 1977, there had been a special alcohol unit in place for about 7 or 8 years. Because I was a social worker, I was interested in family issues. We had about 25 beds. We admitted people who had complicated either physical health or mental health problems, as well as being alcohol dependent. They were taken in for an inpatient detox, and very often then we kept them for about a month, 4 weeks, 5 weeks. But about 90% of the people were managed as outpatients. And the consultant, a very entertaining man, used to refer to this as detoxification on the hoof. And it worked most of the time. But because I was a social worker, I dealt a lot with family issues, and I was curious to see how these children, how they were dealt with in the research literature. Now, back then, it wasn't as easy as it is now. There were not search engines and big databases, so it was a matter of going down to the hospital library, which was a good library, and trying to trawl through. There was very little, but the reference that kept cropping up was this one. Margaret Cork, a woman who worked at the Addiction Research Foundation in Toronto, had written a book, a study of what she called the forgotten children. It was a study of children who were described in the language of the time as having alcoholic parents. And it still is cited and seen as a kind of seminal report. It was a report that did influence people. And from the main title, Forgotten Children, the implication is quite clear, and it comes through her work, that this is a group of children who have specific problems, and that health and social services are generally remiss insofar as they don't identify these problems properly, and even more importantly, they don't provide a coherent response to the needs of these children who have parents who have alcohol problems. And you're probably saying, what relevance is a 1969, a 50-year-old report? When I was preparing for this talk today, what occurred to me was that in many ways nothing has changed. And we still see the same kind of language, which is kind of emotive language, the poor forgotten children. No one is looking after them. And this crops up. So to give you some examples, I describe these as just variations on a theme. Anne Hope is a public health researcher who has done a lot of work in this area. The phrase she used was hidden realities. That was a 2011 study done by what at the time was called the Northwest Alcohol Forum in Donegal. Children's exposure to risk from parental drinking. Hidden realities. The phrase that became popular through the 1990s, people talking about hidden harms. And from earlier this year, a publication really came from HSE, but with collaboration of TUSLA, Hidden Harm Practice Guide, Seeing Through Hidden Harm to Brighter Futures. Again, earlier this year, the Alcohol Action Ireland, which is the single biggest voluntary body that deals with say, public health approaches to alcohol, they started an initiative which they call Silent Voices. I just picked some foreign ones, looked across them. The Scottish 2009 report is Untold Damage. So you get this constant theme coming through that these are children that none of us know. We've forgotten children, hidden realities, hidden harms, silent voices, untold damage. So it's very hard to resist the conclusion that for 50 odd years we have all been kind of wringing our hands and saying, isn't this terrible? These poor children, no one is doing anything about it. And coming through also from most of the reports is the fairly sometimes explicit suggestion, sometimes kind of an implied thing, that these children miss out because they are sort of falling between two stools. You have two service systems. On the one hand, you have adult services like mental health services or specialist addiction services. They look after people who are problem drinkers. And then you have child welfare and family support people who deal with children's problems. And those who work in the adult services are inclined to say, well, child welfare is not our responsibility. People who work in child welfare say, oh, back off. We are not addiction specialists. So that this has been generally suggested that this is the real reason that despite what is, fairly big problem, we don't have any organised, coherent response to date. A lot of what I'm saying is going to have to, unfortunately, be giving you context. And the first one, maybe it's unnecessary, but just to tell you, if you haven't discovered it already, that Ireland is a drinking society. Historically, because of the influence of Roman Catholicism, we didn't have a temperance culture. It is a New York Jewish sociologist, Harry Jean Levine, who interestingly did most of the good work on this, exploring differences in post-Reformation Christianity, where Protestantism tended to take a harder line on alcohol, seeing it as inherently evil, whereas the Roman Catholic tradition was extremely tolerant and continues to be tolerant of drinking. So Ireland, because it was so influenced by Roman Catholicism, didn't have this kind of temperance culture. Of course, the best known example, I suppose, is that in the early 20th century we had about, say, 15-year period of alcohol prohibition in the United States of America, which was influenced by the Women's Christian Temperance Union. We always had a tolerant approach, but if we want to look at changes, and this conference has been talking about change, the changes that are still important today mainly began in the 1960s. The 1960s is regarded as the decade when Ireland came out for the first time of its sort of exclusive, sort of isolationist economic and social and cultural phase, when De Valera became president and we had the first programme for economic expansion, and we began to encourage foreign direct investment and began to think about joining what was called the common market and so on. First hints of modernity, the first time ever that the economy began to slightly improve. That also was a time when the existing Catholic Temperance Association, the Pioneer Total Abstinence Association, began to go into decline. Until the 1960s, the Pioneer Total Abstinence Association had a very strong impact on Ireland, with huge numbers of the adult population continuing to sort of honour a pledge they took when they were in their teens. The other point I'm making there is very relevant to looking at family, is that the 1960s was the very first time that culturally it became acceptable for women to drink. Prior to that, it was culturally regarded as disreputable, and decent women certainly didn't drink. The pubs were pubs. They were sort of male bastions, sawdust and spit, and they were not very welcoming. They were turned into lounges. They put down carpets, put in ladies' loos. And more importantly, the drinks companies, the industry began for the first time to target women. And people of my generation have no difficulty at all in remembering the ads for the first products, alcohol targeted women. And you can remember the Baby Sham ad. Delicate little fawn dancing around on the rim of a champagne glass. Women were not going to be drinking dirty great pints of stout and spitting. From then on, the industry, naturally enough, saw this as an expanding market, and we got dramatic changes in the whole marketing of alcohol and in consumption patterns amongst the Irish public. And the more recent change, only since, say, 2000, that Irish drinking habits changed, in that prior to this, and this has been fairly well documented in all of, say, the health policy documents, home drinking began to emerge as a major feature. Prior to that, Irish drinkers went to the pub, they drank outside the home. Since then, off-licence sales have become big, and there is more alcohol being consumed in family homes. All of this obviously has implications for families with children. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this because it's just, I don't have time anyway. In 1960, annual per capita consumption of alcohol for people over the age of 15, it was 4.9 litres of pure alcohol. that had gone up to, it had trebled, gone to 14.3 by 2001 over a 40-year period. During the economic recession, it dropped again, but it's kind of been creeping up, and in 2016, the last year I could get accurate data for 11.46, and public health people are saying this, by European standards, we're still, we can hold our own when it comes to drinking. The soccer team might struggle to sort of do well in Europe, but when it comes to those other scales of comparing ourselves with Europeans, we're serious contenders. And the other thing you've got to remember about the statistic is a crude, simple mean, but that we have still an unusually large number of teetotalers, that about 20% of Irish adults are still abstainers. This means that those 80% of us who consume alcohol have to compensate for the others. And so all of these figures have to be interpreted with a degree of caution. The policy developments from, I suppose, the late 80s, early 1990s onwards, public health researchers constantly recorded increases in a whole range of health and social problems that were related to alcohol consumption. Another fairly significant development was that the adult psychiatric services, the public mental health services for adults, they disengaged largely from being involved with problem drinkers. This was a time when the place I worked in was closed. All of the big institutions were closed. The number of beds available for adult psychiatry dwindled. Most of the units were now in general hospitals, and psychiatrists were admitting to a very, very limited number of beds. So there was a reluctance, as they saw, to sort of waste beds on this, the kind of moral thing of people who have created their own problems. You've tried them out once or twice, you've told them to stop drinking, and they keep coming back in, and the beds are scarce. So there's probably more sympathy for people with serious psychiatric disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, whatever it is. Gradually, Irish adult mental health services have pulled back, and since the creation of the Health Service Executive, we have now a new specialist addiction service which stands on its own, more or less, as part of the social inclusion programme outside of mental health. The real politics have taken place in relation to the public health doctors and other public health advocates arguing over a long period of time, 30, 40 years, that what we need is legislation that will address the issue in a way that is described, and reasonably enough, as evidence-based, that alcohol should be made less affordable, it should be less available, and it should be less attractive. So the Public Health Alcohol Act was finally enacted just before Christmas 2018. It was 3 years, a record sort of 1,000 days on the books since the publication of the legislation. It was fought, resisted tooth and nail by the drinks industry. The final bill was a good deal, if you pardon the phrase, diluted, and none of it has yet to be actually implemented. So the politics behind this are extremely fraught. Again, if we start looking at what data we have on what we know about the exposure of Irish children to the risks that are associated with parental drinking, it's a complex enough process. We do have some data. One of the ways it's been done is just primary research with community samples of adults, sometimes with children, but asking adults how much they drink. Looking at secondary analysis of data on different aspects of child welfare and protection, say like the TUSLA statistics, which aren't great, I think, but data from the Childcare Law Reporting Project, and I think that there are various other ways in which the issue of parental drinking crops up. Anne Hope's study from the north of Ireland, from the Donegal that were reported earlier from the northwest, she found that 56% of adults who were living with children, they described their own drinking as one that would be described as hazardous drinking. And in that area, she found that a third of the child abuse referrals in that area involved parental drinking problems. In 2010, the ISPCC did a report. Their conclusion was that 1 in 11 children in Ireland are negatively affected by parental drinking. And if you look at Alcohol Action Ireland, again, they're saying something similar. So without going into any detail, if you don't believe me, there's nothing I can do about it. It is a fairly common problem. So the questions then are, how different or how unique are alcohol-related difficulties experienced by children when we compare these difficulties to other familial problems affecting children. The second point I'm making there is just looking at diagnostic systems. And talking about diagnostic systems is probably not as exciting as it seems, but how we conceptualize alcohol problems is crucial, and a lot of the time people are not that clear or not that explicit about what kind of theory they're subscribing to themselves, and popular cultural ideas sometimes are the only ideas lodged in the heads of professionals who perhaps ought to be slightly more well versed. I'm asking, what role can child and family workers who aren't addiction specialists, what role can they play in engaging with parental alcohol problems? And finally, the crucial question a lot of the time is about service integration. How well or how badly do child and family services work in partnership with addiction services in responding to the problems experienced by problem drinkers? I'm going to have to step back from this and give you background context. I'm going to look at two different models of alcohol problem. This first one is known usually as the disease concept of alcoholism, and essentially what he said was that if you consider all drinkers have been on a kind of a straight line, well, roughly 90% of drinkers, it says, are normal drinkers or social drinkers, and 10% unfortunately are alcoholics. And when we look at that, we all say, thank God we're on the left-hand side. This concept, there have been for a couple of 100 years kind of suggestions that habitual problem drinking, which involves, say, physical dependency, that we can think of this as a disease. But in, say, relatively modern times, this was an idea that crept into the developed world from the 1930s onwards, and from the 1940s, from the creation of the World Health Organization. What it says is that alcoholism exists as a discrete disease. Alcoholics are categorically different from other drinkers. Different breed altogether. God love them. Alcoholism is caused by individual vulnerabilities or individual predispositions. Not pretty vague on this one, biological or psychological. The vulnerabilities of a minority of consumers. It's not caused by alcohol per se. Before we all had to be politically correct and gender specific, the Americans used to say the problem is in the man, not the bottle. And could be in the woman, not the bottle nowadays. The disease concept also suggested quite strongly that, and WHO proposes, it has a fixed prevalence in any population. And that prevalence is not going to be affected by changes in population drinking habits. In other words, it doesn't matter if we as a society start to drink more. Because if you're not an alcoholic anyway, if you're not so predisposed, you can drink your head off. And why wouldn't you? In fairness to those poor devils who can't really drink at all, who are on the wrong end of that spectrum. But that was a strong statement, but like most of this at the time it was proposed that this was science. This was objective, factually based stuff. And the final point I'm making then about the disease concept is that it suggested, usually fairly explicitly, that as a disease it was best treated within specialist health facilities, and a lot of the time residential rehabilitation was seen as the ideal start to recovery. There was a student from East Galway that I taught about 20 years ago with a good East Galway accent. And he always argued the toss. No matter how much I could cite research evidence, he said that no matter what, bringing them into hospital for 4 or 5 weeks, it gave a great kickstart to their recovery. And that notion of the kickstart that is going to guide you through was one that was there for a long time. That the optimum way to get people who are alcohol dependent to recover is to bring them in, if needs be, for detox, and then subject them to a structured program, a treatment residential program for, say, 4 to 6 weeks. This, like I say, it was promoted, this disease concept promoted by the World Health Organization from the early 1950s until, say, the mid-1970s, although WHO began to have major doubts about it from a good deal earlier. You have to understand what a lovely concept, the disease concept. There's something there for everybody. It's really nice. It's very popular with ordinary drinkers. We're all ordinary drinkers, aren't we, really? They like the suggestion that most of us can drink with impunity because we don't have those deficits that alcoholics have, the things that unfortunately get them going. The drinks industry itself loved the disease concept because it said there's nothing wrong with the product. People used to say, well, it's a bit like you wouldn't put the boot in on say, shellfish just because a small section of the population is allergic to it. And it's the same thing. The drinks industry liked it. In Ireland, we had a national body, a voluntary body called the Irish National Council on Alcoholism from 1966 to 87. In its early days, it got funding from Guinness. And they were happy to take the funding. That became a little politically dubious later on. And the disease concept was very popular with specialist alcoholism treatment professionals because they gave a rationale for increased funding for treatment facilities. Unfortunately, every single tenet of the disease concept was nonsense. Once people began to do research, every single thing was disproved. The empirical research that started the disease concept gave rise to more funding studying this mysterious disease. And as research went on, it began to sort of disprove all the fundamentals. It had no scientific basis. Social scientists were quick to point out it was a social construct. You could explain it easily in terms of how it emerged in the United States. They got rid of prohibition in the early 1930s, and the question that is asked, if alcohol is a dangerous drug, why are we legalizing it again? So it made sense. Oh no, it's not a dangerous drug at all. It's a perfectly safe drug. It's only a tiny proportion of consumers who have this difficulty. Most of the world, that explanation didn't make a lot of sense. So what was happening is WHO quietly dropped it, and then they began to move towards an alternative, a public health model of alcohol-related problems. In Ireland, the disease concept was officially ratified in 1966 as part of the Committee of Inquiry on Mental Illness. Another example of Irish health authorities kind of being very cagey about adopting something and then getting very enthusiastic about it just as it's being dropped internationally. But if you want to see a really savage attack on the disease concept, you could do no better than to read the Psychiatric Services Planning for the Future, which was published in 1984. Someone referred this morning to A Vision for Change, the 2006 mental health policy document. We've only had 3 mental health policy documents in the history of the state. But in 1984, people say, did Psychiatric Services Planning for the Future say alcoholism wasn't a disease? It said there's no such thing as alcoholism. It's just a silly concept. Dropped it immediately. And to the best of my knowledge, that word alcoholism has never featured in any health policy document over the last, say, 35 years. The new model then presented more like a spectrum. And again, as you can see, it just ranges from there are some drinkers who seem to drink in a way that is harm-free. There are some drinking in a way that is hazardous, that there's risk attached. There's some drinking in a way that is harmful. You can positively identify different harms, health-related harms, social harms, and so on. And then there are some who are dependent, who have developed a full-blown dependency or addiction to alcohol. That normally has physiological features to it, that people will have withdrawal symptoms and so on. But mainly that they return to drinking even when they're dried out or when they're detoxified, and continue to drink despite fairly clear awareness of the harm being caused. The World Health Organization, one of the tools that it uses is this one called audit. And I quote this one because they talk about alcohol use disorders. We're talking about the plural. There are many problems associated with it. And what it sees is that alcohol-related problems, the best thing in terms of what are the dimensions, rather than having a separate notion of category. And problems are conceptualized and they're on a spectrum or continuum. And the other thing it does is they talk about problems being disaggregated. So you kind of pull it apart. It's not just one single disease, but alcohol can cause or contribute substantially to not just a single disease state, but it's a whole host of health and social problems. So you're talking about physical and mental illnesses, family discord, children's problems, industrial absenteeism, public order offences, road traffic accidents, others and so on. And of course, the last point I'm making there is that a lot of the problems that are experienced are not problems that are linked only with the dependency end of the spectrum. If you look at, say, you could take a specific example, like the increase that the Health Research Board has been detailing for years. So the increase in liver disorders amongst Irish women is linked absolutely clearly to the changes in consumption. And most of the women who suffer from alcoholic liver disease are not alcohol dependent. Now, it's not much consolation to you if your liver is bunched to know that you're not on the wrong end of the spectrum. A lot of the road traffic accidents don't involve people who are dependent. A lot of the difficulties faced by children living in homes where parents are drinking may not involve dependence. So what we're trying to do is, using this model, say, well, look, we've got to look across the spectrum rather than get obsessed about that end. Even if we found some miracle cure for alcohol dependency, the suggestion is that we would still be dealing with a whole, probably most of the problems would be unaffected. What does this public health perspective say on alcohol? The phrase that I'm sure some of you have come across is trotted out all the time by WHO over the last, say, 15, 20 years is alcohol is no ordinary commodity. And by that they mean that it ought not to be seen purely in terms of the sort of neoliberal view that it should be there, that consumers should have free access to it, there should be competition, and it should be available, as cheaply as possible. They say it's toxic, which means it's poisonous, it's addictive, it has the capacity to create physical dependency, and it's an intoxicant. It makes people drunk, and it's that sort of being intoxicated then that creates risk of accidents, but also behavioural stuff with people who've been involved in public order offences, things of that kind. And it creates risk of a whole range of health and social problems for all of its consumers, that it isn't just a small section of drinkers. Anyone who drinks is exposed to risk. And for individual risk, the suggestion is that risk is related to consumption levels and to patterns. But it means if you drink only a little, you have a low risk. If you drink more, you have a higher risk. A bit about patterns too is important. The phrase used popularly is binge drinking. It's the difference between someone who drinks 2 pints every night and someone who abstains for 6 nights of the week and then has 14 pints on a Saturday. It's looking at that and trying to understand how risk is related to both the level of consumption and the pattern of consumption. And even though it's a very crude statistic, the simple mean average consumption has proved to be quite a robust predictor of the prevalence of problems. So that contrary to the original disease thing, when a nation, a whole population is drinking more, you have an increase in all of those problems. And this is well documented over and over again in Ireland and internationally. How do you prevent alcohol use disorders? This is where we run into a lot of difficulties, and where the disease concept, I say, was a beautiful concept with something for everyone. This has nothing for anyone. This is, in political terms, a sort of bed and nails. The public health people say that the most effective preventive measures are those that will try to reduce consumption levels within drinking populations by the use of control measures. That is by using pricing controls, restricting availability at retail level, and tight regulation of advertising and promotion. The softer measures, education, public awareness campaigns, sending people into schools, evidence on those is just that they don't make any difference. The drinks industry is very happy to fund alcohol education programs, and this has been a kind of pitched battle over the last 20 years here in Ireland between the public health community and the industry. What's the best way to manage it? Contrary to the ideas on the disease concept, the people who proposed this other public health model, they challenge the idea that you need to be a specialist to intervene effectively with alcohol problems. And they encourage generalists, like people working in health and social care, to develop what they call greater therapeutic commitment. The research all suggests that you can train in brief interventions, and it's not a question of treating an illness, but you're helping people to change and helping people to make change, to maintain change. However, this new public health conceptualization, it's not necessarily well understood by a lot of professionals. In popular cultural terms, the idea of alcoholism still is on. You hear people say, I drinks a lot, but he's not an alcoholic. The belief that specialist residential treatment is best is still very popular with a lot of people. People in private, say, mental health services, where you buy, say, health insurance, it will still admit you to hospital. And it's also proposed by an awful lot of the voluntary bodies who run these specialists, what we used to call Minnesota model places, where you go in for 4 to 6 weeks, even though there's no evidence that these add any additional value to the recovery process. The idea of this being a separate diagnosis and so on it gets even more complicated, where you have groups like proposing the notion that there are people who grew up in families with an alcoholic parent and that they are what are called adult children of alcoholics, ACOAs. So chronologically they're adults, but psychologically they are still dealing with these issues and they're going to have to go to treatment for the rest of their lives. That notion of the special labelling of alcohol problems, again, is one that kind of makes generic workers uneasy, because you're out of your depth, you don't understand these things. Some of the services in the past also promoted the idea of an alcoholic family, where everyone in the family was given a label: the alcoholic, the codependent, the mascot, the lost child. I can't remember the rest of them. But again, this does unsettle generic workers, because I believe this is a highly specialist area. We're out of our depth. Preparing this, the other thing I thought about is that when I was an undergrad, we were told, of course, when you write a research report, you must always write in further research as necessary. We were told this half joking, wholly in earnest, like that you want to get research money. And this is one area where I don't think we need any more research. I think what we need to ask ourselves is why we're not using the existing research. So go back again 40 years, Shaw and his colleagues in England, looking at an empirical research project in South London, looking at a whole range of generic health and social service professionals, all of whom admitted that problem drinkers kept cropping up in their caseloads. What do you do with them? We refer them to specialist services. And do you work with them? No, we don't. So they proposed this kind of sociological role theory to try to explain this. The first one they talked about was role legitimacy. And it referred to that tendency that non-specialist, non-addiction specialist professionals like social workers or family support workers and others say, this isn't a legitimate or appropriate job for us. It's not our job, it's a job for the specialists. Anyway, we don't have the time. It should be enough you refer to addiction counsellors, to the rehabilitation specialists, to psychiatrists or whoever. Role adequacy, this kind of is at the heart of it, is this fear that if you are only an ordinary old family support worker or a public health nurse or a social worker or whatever you are, that you actually don't have sufficient knowledge and competence, that you lack the necessary knowledge, the skills, the overall competence to deal with that effectively. We can't manage this, so you just leave that to the specialists. The third one maybe is most interesting, because it says all of the literature suggests, that the research suggests that generic workers can be really effective. It doesn't take an awful lot of time. All of the models of counselling that have been developed are all based on notions of brief intervention. But in practice, in real life terms, generalist workers won't do this unless they get support. So even if you provide training, say, to family support workers, and it doesn't need to be terribly extensive, it won't work in practice if you don't have their managers actively supporting this and pushing it the whole way through. So what I'm saying there is that there still is, that a lot of the managers are still kind of worried about that kind of the mystique that you need to be very special to work with problem drinkers. And generic workers simply won't do it if they don't get the role support. If we're looking at how in reality do you assess for the impact of problem drinking on children, there's no reason why you couldn't use any of the standardised assessment frameworks that are used by Child and Family Services already. The assessments, very importantly, you don't just look at the problems, but you look at the strengths, the moderators, the factors that sort of soften the blow, as it were. If it's a two-parent family, is there one parent who doesn't have a drinking problem? You look at extended family, grandparents, aunts, uncles, etc., or other friendship networks that can be there to provide support for children dealing with a parent with a drinking problem. You look at a whole range of extra familial support, schools, youth work services, religious institutions, sport, recreation, whatever. All of these are potential moderators that can be used to sort of soften that blow. The risk factors themselves, children who live with parents with drinking problems are subject to abuse, but generally the research says that the abuse is not at that kind of extreme, and it's usually not physical abuse. I think Irish services were very traumatised by the so-called Roscommon case. The report on the Roscommon case must be about 10 years old, but that was an exceptional case where the children were subjected to horrendous and quite unusual, thankfully, abuse. You don't get that much abuse. The financial problems, if alcohol is still relatively expensive, and if family, and this is where social class comes in, if family are low income, a lot of money can be wasted on alcohol, and that leads to difficulties for the ordinary family spending. Neglect is the big thing, that children in those families are often not fed properly, they're not subject to proper parental supervision, they're not maybe difficulties with hygiene or clothing, they're common issues. Young children in those families very often have to take on inappropriate parental roles with their younger siblings. The family generally, the norms are inconsistent, there's confusion about what are the boundaries. This is all quite distressing for the children. However, the strongest thing that has come through all of the literature, and I've just lashed in that one reference, a lot of the kind of evangelical American literature is popular. Some of the British literature, the best of the British literature, is very empirically based. Hard graft, people doing this work really seriously. Orford and Velleman, where some of the American authors would talk about adult children of alcoholics, they say they're looking at adults who were the children of problem drinkers. So it's not just a linguistic difference. And they talk about risk, but they also talk about resilience. A very strong finding is that what really upsets children, it's not so much the heavy drinking or the severity of dependence, if dependence exists, it is the conflict between the parents. The children are most upset when parents fight, and then parents fighting, usually one parent who doesn't have a drink problem fighting with a parent who does. Stereotypically, it's a male drinker. Research again from the 1980s, more than 30 years old, again identified that what distresses children is the sort of breakdown in the fabric of family life. And they found that there are some families where there was severe alcohol dependence, where the fabric of family life wasn't damaged, where the children actually did fine, weren't particularly distressed, and where they were at no greater risk of developing alcohol dependence themselves in their adult lives. It's possible that the whole fabric of family life will be absorbed into the chaos of the problem drinking, and where that happens, this is quite damaging to children. They talk about family rituals. This is essentially talking about the way in which children are creatures of habit. They like routine, they like predictability, and it's possible that even when one parent is not a drinker, that parent can be so caught up in responding to the drinker that all of the family rituals are lost. The daily rituals refer to the kind of standard things like meal times, bath times, bedtimes, pick up from school or nursery, family playtime, and so on. Annual rituals, things like birthdays, holidays, Christmases, lifetime rituals, christenings, and even in a society that is getting more secular, some of the religious rituals are still important, like first communions, confirmations, and then later on family weddings. So these rituals can all be damaged, and if they are, then the children suffer. So one of the ways of helping children where there is a drinking parent is just helping the non-drinking parent to preserve these rituals. And that will allow the children to cope in a relatively good emotional way, despite the presence within the family of a problem drinker. Al-Anon, which is like the relatives' version of Alcoholics Anonymous, has always been quite good on that. They talk about detachment, that the non-drinking person pulling back and saying, I can't stop this fellow from drinking, but I can preserve my own sanity. There is a method called the 5-step method that is used by, again, developed by English researchers, and it is promoted here in Ireland by the Family Support Network. It's a method of working by generic workers with, say, relatives of problem drinkers. Going to talk briefly then just about the addiction specialists, because I've been mainly sort of saying, decrying the failure of the generic workers. The addiction specialists haven't been that helpful either, I suppose. They've been slow to engage with child welfare issues. And some of this reluctance is attributable to a fear that focusing on children's problems, it could damage the therapeutic relationship with adult parents. You want to create a relationship. I'm an addiction counsellor, I'm a professional. If I start getting into childcare issues, this is going to be damaging. They also worry then about the ethic of confidentiality. Can I share information with child welfare services, or is this sort of going beyond the bounds of good professional practice? On a positive note, earlier this year, the Hidden Harm Practice Guide produced by the HSE is a kind of welcome step in that it identifies a lot of things I'm talking about here, and it does indicate a willingness on the part of the addiction services to have a better partnership with the child welfare and family support systems. And if this practice guide is taken up, I think that it does promise to end the situation where problem drinkers are going to fall between these two service systems, fall between the stools. In summary, problem drinking by parents, it does create additional risk for children. But children's problems related to parental problem drinking, they're not unique, they're not radically different from other problems encountered by family support workers. I think we need to persuade generic workers that engaging with parental alcohol problems, given the prevalence of these problems, that is a legitimate function of family support and child welfare agencies and professionals. We need to persuade generic workers that they're broadly adequate. Don't be put off by the mystique of the specialist work. Your generic knowledge and skills are transferable to working with alcohol-related issues. Additional training, and probably not that much is necessary, on alcohol-related issues. Most of the stuff over the last 30, 40 years, motivational interviewing, the community reinforcement approach, the 5-step method I mentioned already. There's training available in all of these. I'll finish by saying that none of this is going to work if that last one, if there is not role support. If management of family support systems and child welfare systems generally don't support workers to deal with this issue, then I'm afraid in another 50 years' time there'll be some unfortunate like myself still here talking about the forgotten children. Thank you.